Okay, so what are we thinking? Last week, very exciting.
There's a lot.
So yeah, so it's sort of a review. I found a different lecture in by Saito, and so it's sort of a review, but I'm going to skip the latter part of the lecture where he gets a little more technical. So should also be interesting too, and not just rehashing completely old stuff. Anybody have any thoughts, questions before we get
Except that
going?
it is very difficult. And I haven't got a clue. Does anyone do anything about it? Are we doing anything about it? Are we rescuing this world?
What?
Well, it depends on who the we is.
I
What?
think it's more aspirational, right? It's
Oh,
it's more a vision of what could be.
No, it
Yeah.
is. Isn't it? It is already there. We have
No,
this road going downhill.
no,
Aren't
we
we?
don't have Marx. We don't have that vision. I mean, we're not there. We're not socialists even, let alone Marxists.
Well, I think where you were going, I think maybe we're not dreaming big enough.
We're not what dreaming.
Dreaming big enough.
Oh,
We
right.
need a bigger vision for what the world should be.
Oh, that's what Sato
I
brings.
think that's what he's trying. Yeah, that's so he
you,
doesn't
That,
have a plan, but he has that idea
I,
that if we start with a bigger vision, bigger dreams,
Yeah,
well,
that
it
makes
can guide
sense.
us.
is there any country that is really thinking about it more than we do? Because we are the most capitalist country.
Yeah. So no, actually, I heard who was it? It's actually a fairly small poor country. I heard. Where would it? Ah, nuts. I can't remember which one, but they committed to going green energy like a decade ago and now have.
Oh,
Um,
that's right. I saw that too
like
somewhere in the headlines.
somebody that has hydropower, but they're not relying entirely on the hydropower because they were discovered with it was no, it was South America.
Oh,
It was Uruguay.
huh.
Uruguay or Nicaragua? Yes,
Yeah, Uruguay,
yes,
I
you're
think, because
right.
they rely on hydropower and have discovered that with droughts coming with global warming, that costs them a fortune to ship in like probably diesel for generators when they need electricity during a drought. And so they've gone green and now their whole energy infrastructure is renewable energy.
Did Marx have any suggestions in his time?
Um, well, I mean, not no, not beyond the big suggestion of we need to change the system.
Okay, yeah.
I have a
But
question.
mhm,
I have a question about what we talked about in class last week.
mhm.
Uh, and I may not have this. It seemed to me that you had a thing where there was one um, point of view, and then there's Marxism is uh, early. He was sort of focusing on just people, and then later with idealism and Hegel, you get philosophical materialism as something different, or dialectical materialism as something different, where you are including the whole universe.
Oh,
Okay, I'm not quite sure what you're asking, but I can try. So
Well,
the way
okay,
the intellectual history works is that people, academics, Western academics, thought about history in those idealist terms, that there are these great figures who want to change the world, and because of the force of their personality and will, they make big changes. And so that's change happens because of people like Genghis Khan or Napoleon or the Caesars or Alexander the Great. So that's how history moves. It moves on the ideas, the visions of these great figures. And that's kind of the view Hegel defends. It's called the great
Okay, right, that's what I wrote down.
theory of history. So Hegel writes this really important book about his philosophy of history, where Hegel has this bigger vision in which God is playing a role of guiding humanity. So that's really idealist history, because now you have God guiding the history. That's God's idea, it's not just human ideas. So there is that's Hegel, late 1700s, early 1800s. Now, around the same period of time, early 1800s, there gets to be the development of the whole idea of materialism, that, well, maybe the world really just is this material stuff. And that first starts in France with figures that don't get to be particularly famous going forward. So what Marx and Engels were doing was they were exposed to this French materialism, which they refer to as kind of crude materialism. And then they're exposed to Hegel's dialectical philosophy, and so they marry those two things. And so you get a materialist theory of history that's dialectical, from Marx and Engels, by combining those ideas.
Okay, all right. I think that makes my notes make a little more sense.
But
Thank
definitely
you.
the whole universe is sort of the idea, the materialist idea, that everything in the universe is a material thing, moving in ways that can be explained
Including
by
people,
including people.
including people. The people are part of it.
Right. So the ultimate
All right.
then that, the ultimate expression of that is what we have now with modern neuroscience, that, the materiality is our brain. So everything we think is still rooted in a material world because it comes from a material brain. So there's no room anywhere for any of that idealist stuff. There's just material. That's the materialist view.
That nothing comes from the
So that
outside.
leads
You're
Does that lead
breaking
to
in and out,
atheism?
Nina.
Is that-
Nina,
the path to
you're breaking
I'm
in and
sorry.
out.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
That
We're only
leads to
Hmm.
it says it's unstable. Am I
you're
talking
frozen.
now? Okay, go.
Okay, yeah, you're intermittently frozen, so it's hard to hear the words. Okay, we'll go on. Hopefully that'll resolve itself. Okay, well, let me get the video queued up here. Share. There we go.
And just to be clear, Marx adopted this materialism view, right?
Yeah, from his early collegehood. So even in his
Okay.
dissertation, he's writing about the early version of materialism that's coming from, that was around in the ancient Greeks.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, he wrote his dissertation on Epicurus, I think.
Oh.
All right, so we're just sort of dropping in here to the middle of his talking, but you've heard a lot of this stuff before, so it's sort of going forward here, I think, is where it gets a little interesting.
In the 21st century, especially because of climate change, those people like Foster especially try to demonstrate that Marx was not
John Bellamy Foster, who we saw last week.
only talking about this kind of ecological issues in some passages in Capital, Das Kapital, thousands of pages, and it's not that hard to find maybe one or two passages where Marx talks about ecology, but he tried to demonstrate that Marx is much more seriously interested in the issue of sustainability. And he also argues that ecological crisis is some kind of the central contradiction of capitalist model production. So Marx was actually kind of eco-socialist. And a famous theory that Foster and his colleagues developed is today called metabolic lift theory. And the point is very simple. I wrote many things, but the point is basically that humans always have metabolic interaction with nature mediated by labor. But in capitalism, this metabolic interaction is mediated by value or price, and commodity. And then capitalism aims to reorganize the entire metabolic interaction between human and nature for the sake of maximization of surplus value, the profit. And what happens is the metabolism of society, the circulation and production and the flow of commodity and money and capital, they expand with the economic growth or capital accumulation. And they also accelerate faster. They invest and they try to get money back as soon as possible with profit and so on. And so this doesn't stop. Continuous expansion and continuous acceleration of social metabolism on the one hand, but the metabolism of nature that human cannot so easily modify. We cannot create fossil fuel artificially. We have to wait millions of years until the formation. But the problem is human extract the fossil fuel in hundreds of years, in just a couple of hundred years. And then we just make some lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But of course, the Earth cannot absorb all the carbon dioxide. So this is a natural process. This is what Marx called natural metabolism. The problem is social metabolism gets faster and bigger. But natural metabolism is more or less stable. Of course, we can intervene a little bit with technology, but it's limited. So Marx basically says there will be inevitably irreparable rift in this interdependent process between social metabolism and natural metabolism. And this will just spread all over the world because of the globalization. That was Marx's warning in the 19th century.
Mm.
And these are just like some passages.
Yeah. So, but remember too, the part of the sort of disagreement that's going on among the different people here is Foster was arguing that he's seeing this ecological vision of Marx in the existent published work of Marx. And Saito's argument is, well, yeah, he wrote so much that a little bit of that does expose some of his ecological thinking, but the real ecological thinking comes later in life and is evidenced in these notebooks that we have from the last 50 years of his life that nobody really knew about until very recently. So Foster, is kind of in an interesting place because people had been complaining about him being a revisionist, that he's changing trying to just change how we understand Marx on the basis of our desire for a different understanding, but it's not really there in the text. But then when Saito comes along, that argument gets undermined in that it may not be in the published text, but it's there in Marx's own handwriting that he was thinking about these things. So it's been a kind of curious little trajectory for Foster, and I think what we saw in those videos for Foster is that he doesn't quite want to admit that the evidence he has is really pretty sparse, which is what his critics are always complaining about. But in the end, his position is much strengthened because Saito and others can point at this stuff that Marx was in fact actually thinking, and that helps us understand the published work a little better. Okay, so Liebig, this is that chemist who was talking about the soil.
That you find in Das Kapital. So still after the research done by Foster, some people said, oh, this is just, as I said, it's just some couple passages and they are over-exaggerating their importance. Marx was still very productivist and so on. And my first book, or it's also my German dissertation, Natur gegen Kapital, is a kind of a demonstration that it's not just some passages. Marx actually took so many notes before he wrote down those couple passages. So if you read his notebooks, or you don't have to even read, if you take a look at them, you realize like how many pages that Marx intensively took notes from books on agricultural chemistry, especially Justus von Liebig, but also about botany, geology, mineralogy, and one of the important books is Karl Flass, but they are like talking also issues, not simply like soil exhaustion, like agriculture, but also excessive deforestation, and that leads to the transformation of the local climate, and also premature slaughter of animals, and even extinction of species because of human intervention in bioecology. So it's very interesting. The Marx didn't really integrate those ideas into his manuscripts of Das Kapital, but it's clear that he was interested in these issues as some kind of concrete manifestation of metabolic lift in various spheres. So it's very
and I do think if there's sort of one thing that you take away from class that you remember, it's that it's metabolic rift. That idea is sort of the most important idea in all of this. The nature has a cycle and capitalism has a cycle, and they're different. And because that difference creates huge problems.
Mhm.
understandable. It's safe to say that Marx was eco-socialist. He was quite critical of capitalist destruction. What he uses the term rout or robbery due to this capitalist development of productive forces. And so that was my first book, and I was happy that I finished my PhD, and I got some like prize and so on. But the problem is, when people read my book, they were like, "Hey, you said in the title Karl Marx's eco-socialism, and you don't talk about eco-socialism." Okay, because this is not a title that I gave. It's a title that Monthly Review Press actually decided to give. And the same problem actually happened with this German book, the Systemsturz. I just talked about this. But there's always the publisher try to sell books by giving some more catchy titles, which creates some problem. But also had some productive impact on me, because then I felt like, oh, I have to then talk more about this concrete eco-socialist future. How does it look like? Why such a society more sustainable? How can they fix this metabolic lift? And why is it not leading to some kind of ecological austerity or ecological dictatorship? And these are the questions that I try to answer in this second book, Marx in the Anthropocene. So the starting question that I tried to answer was the following. So Marx in the 1860s, after leading the Justus von Liebig especially, he came to recognize that the development of productive forces in capitalism is actually just development power of love or robbery. So then here, there's some tension in his general view of history, which we usually call historical materialism. Because historical materialism is like this. We have relations of production on the one hand, and this productive forces or forces of production on the other hand. And the general idea is
So there's labor and there's technology.
that there's a historical tendency that the productive forces develops.
That's the technology.
Innovation, and we want to overcome different kind of scarcity and so on. So there is always the higher productive forces in the course of history. And the problem is, after a certain point, the existing relations of production, like slave system,
No labor is working.
feudal lord on here in the capitalist, they kind of try to stick to the old way of doing it, and it really hinders the further development of productive forces. So then, after a certain point, this is an increasing tension between relations of production and productive forces, and the basic idea is once this productive forces reaches a certain point, there's an explosion. And then the mode of production, which encompasses both sides, will transform too. So from slavery economy to feudalism to capitalism, and then one day socialism and communism. So this is a very simple idea, but then easily it becomes like a maximization of productive forces is the precondition for any revolution.
So one thing that I consider, I heard an interesting example. Richard Wolff, the economist, was talking about this the other day. That if you visit China, the way people get around primarily is on high-speed trains, and the trains are pretty, they're shiny new, and they're going like 250, 300 miles an hour or something absurd like that. It's just insane. And we're a much richer country than China. Why do we have broken down derelict trains and broken highways and people complaining about our bridges? And the Chinese have these shiny new trains that go 3, 4 times faster than ours. And it's because the entity that built the trains wasn't interested in profit in China. Those are government companies, government entities that are doing these. And so they don't have a profit motive. And so they can develop and deploy this technology. But here we could, in theory, have that technology, have even better trains, but we don't because the profit motive doesn't allow it. And that's the contradiction thing that he's talking about, that the relations of production actually come to get in the way of the forces of production. And so if you take profit motive out of the equation, you actually can have much freer development of technology because the development isn't dependent on can someone make a profit from it or not. It's useful.
Go ahead. So that's contradictory to what we've been told, of course, is that only through profit motive can we have innovation.
Exactly. Yeah. Turns out someone was lying to you.
Yeah. Well,
now, obviously, you can get innovation that way, but you're only going to get some innovation. There's other innovation that you get excluded from, which is that's the irony of the whole thing.
well, yeah, it's just, I mean, we do have examples like the vaccines, the Salk vaccines, and that they were originally developed without regard to the profit motive.
Mhm.
And Malcolm Gladwell has a new book out, and he talks about this lonely government worker who actually discovered the algorithm of finding people once they are in the water, so you can figure out where they fell, and then with the currents and everything like that. And it was a government worker who found that, and we now have that system in place that we can locate people.
Huh.
Yeah.
Gladwell's fascinating. He comes up with amazing details and examples.
I know, exactly. And he names the blah, 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 but yeah. And I just have to add this: when one person was actually found, soon after that discovery, I think Malcolm tracked him down.
Oh, wow.
And he said, "Do you know why you were saved?"
Oh.
And he goes, "Yes, Jesus saved me because, and of course, Malcolm said, actually, it was, so and so who.
Wow. Oh, that's great. Yeah. And he's such a great storyteller.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
But I'm sorry, I just want to add, those people, I'm going to say those people who do only think of money and the profit motive can't even imagine somebody doing something for the greater good.
Yeah, though we get into that kind of, the people develop those kind of attitudes. Yeah. Really narrow thinking.
Right.
Yeah, I can't even imagine why would someone do something just because it's good.
Yeah.
Or useful.
That's why we have Trump.
Yeah.
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 That's right.
So that's why understandably, many socialists in the 20th century kind of fell into this kind of productivist idea. But the problem is, if you accept this eco-socialist idea that development of productive forces in capitalism is actually increasing power of destruction, it's no longer really development of productive forces, right? So this is the problem. We don't have no longer this kind of linear progress of history based on the continuous development of technology and forces of production. And it also creates one more problem because then with this linear idea of history, the Western people could say, hey, we are better than Asians or Africans because we have better technology. So Marx had this kind of idea too. Let's just invade India. And then we will bring, like British people will bring some better technology. And then maybe we will have a revolution there too. So that's good. So this
Okay, so there's a really interesting example. A historian that I encountered many years ago used that I hadn't even heard of, but it's worth sharing with you all. Have you heard of the Iron Pillar of Delhi?
The one?
Mm-mm.
Iron Pillar of Delhi. Okay, so it's this big pillar. It doesn't seem to want to rust, and let's see, where can we get? It was built in the 5th century. So people in India somehow figured out the technology to refine iron to the point where they could build this amazing pillar that doesn't rust. And apparently it took Western scientists until like just a couple decades ago to even figure out the chemistry of it and why it was so long lived. So this idea that the rest of the world didn't have technology or science is really ludicrous, but it's the view we get raised with here, that the Asia and Africa is just backwards. And it's like, well, it became backwards. But yeah, maybe there's a story to tell about why it is the way it is now. And it's not just that it's always been that way, that something happened that got in the way of them, having this kind of technology and developing all of this technology, or just different ways of living that existed in Africa and Asia through the centuries. So anyway, I thought this was just an interesting example of where Western thinking on India goes wrong.
Mhm.
There's another thing occurred to me along the way, that I have heard people say that if if you just distributed the wealth that exists in the world today in a more fair manner, everybody on the planet would have a reasonably comfortable lifestyle.
Mhm.
So I haven't heard Saito talk about that yet. And it seems like that would be a really useful point for him to make in this argument with people, with these productivists who run into him and say, well, no, we can't possibly, have degrowth because we need to produce more to get people out of poverty. When one answer to that is we already have that wealth. So there isn't a problem of needing to generate more because it's here already. Anyway, it was a curious point that that he doesn't talk about that particular detail. But all right.
this kind of simple idea doesn't also hold anymore because then actually what Western society possess are more power of destruction or killing people, and that's actually today's situation. But so then it's no longer really clear which society is more superior or which society is on the higher stage of history and so on. So Marx was actually compelled in the 60s, especially late 60s, to reconsider his biased Eurocentrism as well as his productivism together. And that's why he had to kind of start from the scratch. He's in the identity crisis after publishing Volume 1. The middle-aged man who thought that Capital Volume 1 will be super successful bestseller, but it wasn't like that. And then even his idea of history is falling apart. So that was like a really deep crisis, I think. And that's why, understandably, he started seriously starting again. And I think that's great. He started studying natural sciences. He even started learning Russian, and he started reading books on Russia, but also about Asian societies and even indigenous society in North America too. So there's a really like restart for the late Marx in the 70s especially. And so
actually,
that's one thing.
that fluidity with language is something I'm very jealous of, and Saito's fluidity with language too. But apparently, Marx oversaw the the first French translation of Das Kapital himself, because his French was fluent enough that he could read what the translator had come up with and see if he agreed or didn't agree or wanted to change it somehow. But I just thought that was amazing. And then here he is, in his 50s. Well, I got to figure out what's going on in Russia. I guess I need to learn Russian. And then he learns Russian. Ah, oh, my sister had this kind of ease with language, and it missed me somehow. But I've always been very, very jealous of people who just can learn languages.
two topics. One is natural sciences, but the other is non-Western pre-capitalist societies. And interestingly, in his very late stage of his life, he get a letter from Russian, and a Russian revolutionary, Vera Zasulich.
All right. So Vera Zasulich. Since we're being scholarly, I thought I would look this up. So here she is, born 1849, died 1919. She's actually a member of the Menshevik Party at the end of her life. But obviously someone who is very active in socialist politics in Russia from early on. So this letter of hers starts with this very it's this is it. This is the letter that she wrote to Marx. And it's filled with these questions about, what does he think? What does he think of this? What does he think of that? And then, as you've heard him mention, oh, I gotta figure out how to move this thing. He actually wrote 5 drafts of his response to her. And look at, the word count, right? So the first draft, he has this very thoughtful response that's very detailed. That's like 4,500 words. What is that? It's 9 pages, maybe typed out, double spaced. And then in the end, the reply he sends is just 350 words. So there is something going on, and Saito doesn't talk about the details of it. He just says there were some political issues in how Marx felt he could reply or not reply to her that leads him to this change. But what it means, though, is that you get all of this interesting thinking from him in this very long reply that is his first draft. And so that's the stuff that Saito's relying on, is finding things like this in the archive and being able to read the draft instead of relying on just the last letter that he actually ended up writing. So, but it's anyway, it's too long actually to go through the whole thing, but I just thought I would just show you that it's out there. If you're curious, you can actually read these things. This one is from an archive called Marxist.org. But I just searched on her name and found it. It was very easy to find.
And she was asking Marx that what kind of revolution is possible in Russia. Because Russia is not Western capitalism. Russia is, organized in a very different way. There are still many agricultural communes, and they have still some kind of collective ownership of land and also collective production. And of course, some productivist Marxists say, oh, first eradicate those pre-capitalist, leftovers, and then modernize, then we will have socialism. But this sounds not convincing for Zasulich. So she decided to ask Marx directly what he thinks about the Russian situation. Should Russia follow the Western development? Isn't it a little bit kind of overgeneralization of theory? And is it basically like Eurocentric idea to say that? Huh? So it's, I think, very shocking for Marx, because this is exactly the problem that Marx also had. And that's why he was studying those societies very intensively. So he actually took this opportunity to formulate some of his final ideas. It's 1881, and he dies in 1883. So it's like a very last moment.
Very last.
And he wrote 3 manuscripts for this letter. But he didn't send it. He just sent a very brief letter in the end because of some political reasons and so on. But anyways, we can now read these letters and the manuscripts, and it's very interesting for several reasons. One is that he actually said that historical inevitability of the law of capitalist development that he discusses in Capital is expressly limited to the countries of Western Europe. So the Russia is exception. The Western society is rather exception. So it doesn't, Russia, Asia, other parts of the world, it's different. And he even says, if the Russian Revolution becomes the signal for proletarian revolution in the West, so that the two complement each other, then Russia's peasant communal land ownership may serve as the point of departure for communist development. So now Marx even recognizes that Russia can just begin its own revolution first. It's not Russian must follow. No, they have their own agency to make history, and then followed by the Western proletariat art, and then they just work together. And so that's like a real good, different path to socialism is possible with their own.
Now, remember, and I don't know if maybe I haven't talked about this too much, but this is the big issue that exists with Leninism as an interpretation of Marxism. Lenin, this is the idea that Saito, I think, is fighting, that it is an entrenched idea that Lenin is coming along and skipping the stages that Russia is supposed to go through according to Marx's theory. So, and that's always so there's been this centuries-long debate inside Marxist scholarship about the place of that. What does it mean that Lenin is taking control of history in a way that Marx wasn't talking about? And then it turns out that here towards the end of his life, Marx himself has the same idea that Russia can, in fact, skip over this capitalist development stage and catch up on the development later on, which ultimately what Stalin does, but in the face of World War II. So it's very different context than people had in mind, which actually reminds me of an important point Marx makes is that he says, might be in the Gotha program, but he says people make history, but they don't make it on their own terms. You find yourself in history, and then you can respond to what you find, but you can't create that context. And so there's a certain amount of freedom of movement, but it is contextually limited. But then decades later, that same idea then applies to Russia. That he's saying yes, Russia could do this. He's seeing a possibility for Russia to do this.
Initiative. So Kevin Anderson actually say, oh, this is a very different multilinear view of history, and this is even like a post-colonial Marx is the final Marx. And then some people criticized this. Like Stedman Jones, he thinks that this is all wrong. This is very kind of a romantic, fetishized view of the non-Western society. So his interpretation is like, okay, Marx became very disappointed after the defeat of the Paris Commune. And then the Western European countries became kind of reactionary, conservative situation. So no hope of a revolution. And then the Russian people came, approached him, and like, oh, we want to translate your book into Russian, and we have like many interesting movements actually going on. Why don't we collaborate? So Marx kind of had this excitement, and in the end, he had this very wrong view of Russian revolution. So that's like old Marx losing his capacity to critically understand, and so just don't, use Marx. That's Stedman Jones' conclusion. So this is a very actually anti-Marxist book, I find. And the more fundamental problem is both Kevin Anderson, who is more sympathetic, and Stedman Jones, who is more critical, are not paying enough attention to the entirety of Marx's theory, because they're only talking about non-Western pre-capitalist societies. But Marx was also studying natural sciences. So he was studying both at the same time. But the problem is they don't take, Kevin and Stedman Jones don't take these natural science notebooks into account. So I think they are related, but the problem is it's not connected well. And my hypothesis was basically they are connected based on the theory of metabolism or Stoffwechsel, because Marx was studying the conditions of sustainability, like some kind of like what capitalism destroys and what happened to nature and the environment and so on, what kind of material conditions must be satisfied for eco-socialism and so on. But it was very hard for him to imagine a different way of organizing this Stoffwechsel metabolism. So understandably, he had to look for other places, other histories, other ways of organization, other traditions, and they have other laws about other customs, like different ways of collectively managing land, production, and so on. So it was for him both connected to imagine, in order to imagine a more sustainable production and how capitalism destroys that kind of metabolic interaction and transforms. And so from that perspective, using the theory of metabolism as some kind of background condition, it's possible to connect both his study on natural science and non-Western pre-capitalist societies. And interestingly, if you have this idea in your mind, and then go back to the letter to Zasulich, he actually said something like this. Today, capitalism faces a social system, which both in Western Europe and the United States is in conflict with science, with the popular masses and with the very productive forces that it generates in short in a crisis. So capitalism is in crisis because of working class movement, but also because of science and because of productive forces. What does he mean? Traditionally, people read this passage as very traditional way. So historical materialism, so the higher working class demanding better life, and then there's like productive forces, so more development, but this capitalism is hindering the further development. So this is a crisis, and then only this explosion of the contradiction could solve. This is a very Marxist-Leninist reading. However, considering Marx was already ecologically conscious in Capital, Volume 1, written in 1868, and he was criticizing this kind of productivist view because capitalist development of technology actually only destroys conditions for sustainable metabolic interaction. It's not really convincing to read these passages in such a productivist manner. So we have to find another way of reading this. And it's interesting how he says about Levy, for example, because capitalism was criticized by natural scientists at the time too. The main figure was Levy, And basically, he's saying that the capitalism ignores the condition of rational agriculture, rationale Landwirtschaft, because it just tries to maximize the profitability in the short term. So when he uses the term like rational, it means basically sustainable, long year kind of. And he was criticizing capitalist agriculture as globally loud. And inspired by that, Marx was talking about more future society that governs metabolic interaction with nature in a rational way. So this is a scientific critique of capitalism, capitalism as irrational system. This is something that today people like Rockström is talking about with planetary boundaries and so on. So it's something similar was happening at the time. So that's maybe the meaning that Marx means that the capitalism faces a conflict with science, like today, basically. Then how does this crisis end? He says, Marx says, the crisis of capitalism will end through its own elimination. So capitalism must be gone. Through the return of the modern society to a higher form of an archaic type of collective ownership and production. This is very interesting, actually. Marx doesn't think that capitalism's elimination takes place by maximizing productive forces. No, he says actually it's the opposite. The Western societies need to return to pre-capitalist society for the sake of establishing communism. But what does it mean? It's not just going back to nature, because he also says it's a higher type, higher form. But this is very different from the traditional productivist view, because he's something.
Well, and also worth pointing out here, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels refer to primitive communism as the first form of human economy. What they're referring to is really going back to before the Iron Age, to more Stone Age formations. But the idea that living in small bands that are basically democratic, because everyone sort of has an equal sort of amount of power. You might have a leader who's a little charismatic, maybe, who can organize people, but you don't have, there's no significant, there's no class differences between those people. Everybody's part of the same socioeconomic class. So they call that primitive communism. And so since the time of the manifesto, I mean, they've always had this idea in mind that returning to an old form, but in an elevated type. So communism, as a future project, then would be a kind of return to this primitive communism in its egalitarian ethos, but radically changed because we would be living, in such a different technological context in our world, but transformed in terms of its social relations. So anyway, so it's sort of curious. He hasn't. That's another thing he hasn't mentioned in all of the talks I've seen, is he doesn't mention that primitive communism is actually this old idea that they were already working with in 1848.
Interesting here the results of what he learned of non-Western pre-capitalist societies. So my conclusion is basically that Marx, after studying natural sciences and as well as non-Western pre-capitalist society, he came to recognize that non-Western society had a very different way of organizing Stoffwechsel with nature, and actually in a very sustainable way. People were not even more equal because of the collective means of land, and they had, very traditional way of living. So people are basically equal, but also it's more sustainable because the production was not for the sake of growth. It was mainly for the sake of satisfying needs. And also it was based on the tradition. Last year or tens of thousands of years, we did this way, so we do this way this year again. So there was no really technological development, which Marx hated in the 50s. That's why he was supporting the idea of British imperialism because it brings the kind of historical dynamism to Indian communes, more development, trains, ship, new technology, machines. That really begins the historical development in India or in other places. But here, Marx just has opposite view. Good, actually, that kind of stasis is good because it means sustainability. It means equality. Otherwise, this society would have vanished thousands of years ago. That even today, like even the end of 19th century, or like some indigenous communities here today in 21st century, that they still exist means that they have so much power too, so much power to survive, even in front of this gigantic power of capital. So this is something that Marx really changed his idea. And he celebrates now this idea of stationarity, the kind of as a kind of material foundation for sustainable and equal society. And Western society needs to return to this kind of archaic type. But of course, with today's technology, with Western capitalist technology, not everything, but things that we can still use. Yeah? So this is basically the moment Marx became degrowth communism, I believe. I think it's very different from just maximization of technology, productive forces, and then overcome all the limitation, and then we will have some kind of happy society. Rather, this is a really serious learning from non-Western societies, or today's expression, global South, and also self-critical attitude towards capitalist productivism and how it destroys the environment and so on. This is a very different kind of idea. He tried to learn from the global South. He tried to integrate what he learned to his new vision of the future. Then that really created not just simply different paths to socialism exist in Asia, in Africa, in Western Europe. No, the vision of post-capitalism itself, the idea, the content, or whatever you say, changes too. Because now it's not about maximization of production, it's not about technology, it's not about extraction of more wealth from nature, it's degrowth communism. So that's basically my conclusion, but people criticize it is then a new kind of austerity. So that's something I try to answer as well. My favorite passage is basically one from Critique of Gotha program, written in 1875. What's interesting is, I admit that Marx never said degrowth communism. It's just something that he was trying to develop his new ideas in his letter and in his notebooks, but he was not able to formulate his ideas in that clear way that I'm now describing, of course. But he was, of course, ambivalent. He was always kind of going back and forth, and that's interesting. But it means that once we recognize some possibility of reading Marx in a certain way, we can project back to the 70s and even 60s, because then you also find some passages that Marx was also hinting this kind of transformation. But these passages are often read in a productivist manner too. So this is a very representative, and this is a very famous passage about communism. So let me read this. He says, in a higher phase of communism, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and thereby also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished. So no division of labor anymore, and no more bosses only ordering others to do things and so on. After labor has become not only a means of life, but also life's prime want. So alienation is gone, work is so much fun. I hope that it's gonna be happening. After the productive forces have also increased, And here he talks about increase of productive forces, of course, with the all-round development of the individual and all the springs of commonwealth, genossenschaftliche Leistung, flow more abundant. Only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety and society inscribed on its banners, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. So what's interesting in this passage?
Okay, so narrow horizon of bourgeois right. Um, there's actually a there's a source of a longstanding argument debate um, with bourgeois liberalism and its disagreements with Marx's thinking, but they're coming from a different kind of direction. So you think about someone like John Stuart Mill, who's writing in England um, a little bit before Marx, but around that same time period. And it's from the work of people like that, Mill and Locke and even Hobbes, and on the German side, Kant, that we get this idea of liberal society. And to think about, especially which has its most applicability, I think, in cities. But the idea is that there's a kind of freedom that the individual has by virtue of being a little bit anonymous in the society. And so the individual can do what they want to do by not imposing on others and having others not impose upon them. And but the thing that the lifestyle that's being envisioned there seems to like this a very urban lifestyle of going to coffee houses and having discussions with friends and going to the opera or going to the symphony and that the freedom is the freedom to create this lifestyle that one wants in that kind of in an environment that's rich enough and technologically sophisticated enough to sustain that sort of lifestyle. And it's contrasted with the narrowness of small town life, right? So in a small town, everyone knows who you are. So you walking down the street, everyone you see, you know, vaguely, if not well. Whereas walking down the street in a city, you see lots and lots and lots of people you've never seen before and will never see again, and hardly ever run into someone you actually know. Unless you're meeting them, you know, intentionally, or you happen to be in a place where you know they congregate. And so that's what I mean by the anonymity of that kind of lifestyle, that you walk through the world and people don't necessarily know who you are. And so there is freedom there. Well, the reason the you know, Marx even called the theory that he's developing communism. You know, that he's even in the word is signaling a different kind of vision that is more reminiscent of that small town life, that the commune. And even if when you update that into what do we mean by that kind of language in our world today? And I think one of the best examples of that is what this guy Richard Wolff has been doing, where he's talking a lot about workers' collectives as the kind of formal organizational solution to this problem. That so you don't have to have a capitalist who owns the firm if all of the workers own the firm. You bring democracy into the firm because you don't have an owner anymore. You don't have a board of directors. You just have the workers themselves organizing and running the workers' commune. But that very model is demanding that the individual pay attention to and participate in the governance of that firm. And there are people who resist that because it feels too intrusive. It feels they might even call it paternalistic, although there's no really they're their own paternal force. But anyway, but it, you know, it's sort of that the world is guiding the individual in their actions by putting demands on them in various places. And so even democratic society, in a way, places demands on people that if we lived in a really fully functioning democratic society, people would have to spend some time learning about issues, learning about politicians, learning about history in order to really act on what they know in order to bring about what they want as part of that democratic organization. Well, those are all demands on the individual that liberal society in these classic formations is resisting for the sake of a different kind of freedom, that freedom from society. Well, and I'm not sure that there's a solution to this problem. I think it's just people are going to disagree, and that there are some people who resist that, and then other people who respond to it like with it in just seeing that as the ultimate positive development they could possibly get. Oh, you mean community? That yeah, everyone's going to live in community and they will know their neighbors and know the people they work with because they have to make these decisions with their neighbors about what their city looks like. They have to make these decisions with their coworkers about what their workplace looks like. And all of that is forcing the individual into a whole myriad of social relations that capitalism can allow you to distance yourself from if you want. And just let go. I don't have to participate in my neighborhood watch. I don't have to participate in a union. I don't have to participate in governing the firm that I'm part of. I can just go and do my job and go home and do what I want. So anyway, so I just wanted to just sort of lay that out there, just so you're all aware of it, is that there is that kind of social critique of this construction of society that's out there. That I don't think Saito just sort of assumes the good parts of having the post-capitalist society, and we're all living in various communes of some sort. But there are people who have issues with it. So.
But initially, even in communes, or if we created a collective, I mean, voting for someone to look out for our interests, somewhat like we do politically, might be the beginning stage rather than each individual contribution. You
Yeah,
know,
but you're still
you vote for the people that you want to represent you.
Yeah. So, I mean, you don't want to necessarily take this model into politics completely because
No, not politics. I mean, in the collective, within the collective, another
yeah,
way without capitalism to not be engaged is to delegate, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, right. And okay, are you minimizing that or are you maximizing that?
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, but Richard, we are so dependent upon the stocks and bonds in our lives now. When you get older, your social security, where is it invested? How is it invested? How do you know where it is invested?
Mhm.
You don't know if it's child labor that makes you money. You don't know.
Yeah.
So I think we're so invested already into this capitalist system. I don't see how we can get out of it. Really. How
Well,
can
I think historical change is always like that, though. That it's really hard to imagine what people will do in the future if they change things. Because there are people who thought that if you did away with slavery, the whole society would just collapse.
that's true. Yeah.
I just couldn't imagine any possibility of that. How
Yeah,
would
but in a certain way, we still have slave labor.
well,
You
that's
know,
true. Yeah,
and we do.
that is true. That is true. But formally, we got rid of it. Yeah, but yeah, my point is just that yeah, it's always how change can happen can often seem mysterious to us until we're looking back on it, and then it's like, oh, well, that wasn't really actually as hard as we thought it was, or the change was more natural than we thought it might be.
Just women in the workforce, right,
Big
was
change.
thought to be catastrophic to the system.
Yeah, society would fall apart.
Yeah, but then they started to wear the uniform And I think capitalism has a lot to do with all the wars we are creating, even in the Ukraine. It's all about the materials that's in the earth that we are
Yeah, no, I think
fighting
you're
for.
right. Yeah, right. Yeah. No,
We're not fighting for a better life for everybody. We're just fighting for getting all that stuff that is in the earth. We
yeah.
depleted the whole of Africa from everything they had.
Or at least easy to get at stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So
No, I think you're right. Yeah.
I'm
No.
kind of that pessimistic about this world.
I'm getting a sense of that. But Hegel has this wonderful line. It's one of the more famous things he said, where he says, "The owl of Minerva only takes flight with the coming of the dusk." I think is the way he puts it. Owl Minerva being a symbol in ancient Greece of wisdom, but the idea being that real wisdom only comes from looking backwards. That we know things, we know history because we can look back on it. But when we're looking forward, it's all much more opaque. Looking forward.
Yeah.
So that's true.
Although it seems like Sato has a clear vision in a way of what the world could look like.
Well, I would say it's more he has some outlines.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. An outline of what the world could be.
Yeah.
Am I still frozen? Can you?
No,
Oh, yes.
actually, that sounds pretty good.
Lauren Isley is a biologist, and he said about people, the catastrophe always has to come first.
Hmm.
Oh,
And that means that, we deal with catastrophes. We don't prevent catastrophes.
And then learn and do something different.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a powerful observation, I think.
Yep.
yeah.
Is the term genossenschaftlichalized. And he at the same time talks about kind of productive forces increase, and then it means that they can produce more and so on. So it seems kind of, some people say it's a very productivist vision of communism. Here he celebrates the more material production and more productive forces, and then we can use those technology to develop our capabilities and potentialities and so on. Matt Huber would say so. So this is, for some people, the negation of degrowth communism. But for me, this is a very interesting passage as well. Why? Because if this passage is about private jet for everyone, I would say that kind of society is still trapped in the narrow horizon of bourgeois life. That everyone possesses big cars, big house, big whatever. And it's not really very different from capitalism. It's just like a better capitalism that everyone becomes capitalist. What's important is this Genossenschaftlichkeit. And he was studying Marx Genossenschaften, and he is also studying the different kind of like pre-capitalist communities, and it's called often Genossenschaft. And this is kind of commonwealth has different kind of abundance, different kind of richness. And if you realize this is kind of like a richness of Genossenschaftlichkeit, then you go beyond the narrow horizon of bourgeois life. I think this is what he means. And this is something that the capitalism hinders us from developing too. Capitalism allows us to produce many things for private consumption and a private kind of Genuss, the joy, but it doesn't allow us to collaboratively, like together, develop some kind of commons for the sake of everyone. And that is something that today in English, like a public luxury or communal luxury, the öffentlicher Luxus or something like that. And this is something that is really disappearing in this society of capitalism. Everything is commodified, everything becomes private ownership. Public transportation, education, medical system, all degrading in the way the commonwealth, nothing anymore. And so this is what that makes difference is some kind of society based on Genossenschaft, the abundance of Genossenschaft visualized. And this is something very different.
So there's another passage in the Gotha program that's real famous where he talks, Marx seems to be talking about what he thinks a future society might look like. And he says that one could fish in the morning and hunt in the afternoon and do criticism in the evening, by which he means without becoming either fisherman, cattleman, or critic. That it's I mean, it's part of this division of labor thing, right? So that people's lives could be much more well-rounded if they're not being forced to specialize as one peg that fits into one particular hole in the capitalist system that defines who they are and somehow wants to define their essence. But instead, they just become things to do. And so you do them, or someone else will do them if they're better at that, and you do something else. And so our lives become much less defined by that external world and more defined by our own interests and our own desires. But I think that's an important sort of framework to keep in mind about, that he's envisioning this when he talks about doing away with division of labor, that the point of that is he's seeing radical kind of freedom that comes with that, as well as more social justice, more equality.
Different from what we usually associate with Marx. Because, as I said, Marxism is often productivist, higher productive forces. But these are, I think, all trapped in the narrow horizon of bourgeois life. And this new reading of Genossenschaftlicher Leistung is, of course, compatible with Degrowth's idea. And it is also against austerity because it focuses on the new idea of abundance, not material abundance, but also this kind of communal abundance, communal luxury, which is very important for today's ecological crisis because we have the only limited resources. We have this time limit for decarbonization. That means that it's really necessary to think about a way of reducing our ecological or material footprint while also not leaving anyone behind. So I think this communal luxury is based on sharing, helping each other, and is kind of guaranteeing everyone the basic access and so on, is some very important idea even for 21st century.
And there's something in there too that I've noticed it happening in the larger culture. This people are taking sort of excess resources, and instead of wanting to acquire more things, more interested in acquiring experiences. And I think that the communal luxury, that's really what's going on in that idea, is that the point is not like the one of the women that we saw early on used that word, and I think she talked about swimming pools, right? That if the neighborhood has this amazing swimming pool, why would any one person in the neighborhood want to build a swimming pool in their backyard? So, and I think it works generally, that idea works. You scale that up massively, that everything in society, you start measuring it differently, that if it's provided socially, there is an experience to have instead of a thing to acquire, like going to the museum, or learning or taking a class to learn a foreign language, or there are all kinds of the world's full of possible experiences. And if the society has radically shifted how it measures what is luxury, And instead of luxury being about things, luxury is about experiences. You can create this radically different structure that's very rewarding for people, but doesn't demanding all of the stuff because you've reorganized the stuff collectively. Communal museum, communal swimming pool. And you can even take that the Soviets for real early on tried to do this with laundries and kitchens. In order to free women from the drudgery of domestic labor, what do? You have a communal kitchen, so everybody can go there. Or can I think they like the word use the word canteen at the time. Everybody would go there for their meals instead of eating their meals at home. Need the laundry done, you take it to the communal laundry. You don't have to do the laundry at home. And so there are ways in which the society can respond and solve lots of problems for people by taking the drudgery out of their individual life and making it a communal project to solve the problem that way.
You know, about 30 years ago when I visited Greece and my relatives, what struck me was my cousins didn't have ovens or stoves.
Oh,
So what they did, and of course Greeks have a lot of wonderful baked dishes. So what they would do is take it to the bakery and
oh,
have them bake it for them and pay them, you know, some money. But
yeah.
I found that fascinating, and I bet they're going in the opposite direction. And today probably everybody has their own
Oh, yeah,
stove and
yeah.
oven.
Communal ovens. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, see, I mean, all kinds of good ideas around the world.
But we thought of it as poverty, right? I mean,
Right.
I didn't, but yeah,
Yeah, because they don't have a thing.
they don't have an
Things.
oven.
Too few things. Yeah.
I thought that was
Oops.
freeing.
And here's my
What did I do here? Sorry. Yeah, free. Exactly. It's freeing.
It's liberating. That's one expense you don't have to pay for it or take up room in your home.
Exactly. Yeah. Don't have to fix it when it breaks down. Someone else is going to take
Yeah,
it.
that's right.
Okay, so here he is laying out. I say this is kind of an important little schema here. Let me back this up just a second since I disrupted it.
this time limit for decarbonization. That means it's really necessary to think about a way of reducing our ecological or material footprint while also not leaving anyone behind. So I think this communal luxury is based on sharing, helping each other, and it's kind of guaranteeing everyone the basic access and so on is some very important idea even for 21st century. And here's my kind of summary. The traditional Marxism or socialism was fetishizing growth, and they didn't care about green technology. And some recent eco-socialists like Matt Hoover are advocating eco-modernism, defending not only growthism, but also pro-green technology. And they criticize degrowth is Stone Age communism. So they are like not only anti-growth, but also anti-technology. Let's go back to nature kind of thing. But the thing that I try to defend is not Stone Age communism. We do need electric vehicles. We do need renewable energies. But it doesn't require this infinite capital accumulation anymore. And even in socialism, infinite growth is bad for the environment. So this is the idea of degrowth communism. A different way of organizing nature, different way of organizing technology and so on. This is my final slide, and just trying to highlight the difference between eco-modernism and degrowth communism. The eco-modernism is a continuation of the Western imperial project. This is a very problematic view. We have this kind of technological efficiency, so we can just keep whatever we are doing because it's we have brought about better technologies and so on. But that is also accompanied by colonial, imperial kind of extraction of wealth and destruction of nature, land grabbing and some genocide and so on. So degrowth is actually the total opposite. It recognizes this kind of historical responsibility and thus advocates some kind of new project of decolonization. And second, eco-modernism is quite clearly tied to the issue of productivism, growthism, and extractivism. And on the other hand, degrowth offers a more eco-feminist subsistence perspective. So I didn't talk about ecofeminism, but I wanted to highlight that, it's not just Marx who, of course it's not. I'm rather learning from degrowth people or ecofeminism, and then it sounds very convincing. Huh? So then how should I do with this theory that I learned in the last 15 years? So what should I do with Marx? Is Marx just useless? So what should I do? And I think it's a very interesting way of integrating this idea of subsistence perspective. It's not about growth, it's about care, it's about mutual aid, it's also about the connection with nature. That's what I mean with the spirituality here. And these are the things that I think the eco-socialist degrowth also needs to integrate. And this is not something like I think Marx can do very well, but I think it's possible to do. And an eco-feminist tradition of Maria Mies, Vandana Shiva, and so on are very helpful to imagine that kind of integration. And finally, the eco-modernist technology does not realize post-scarcity economy. And this point is very important because we are so used to believe that someday the new technology like nuclear fusion will realize abundance. AI, robot, and then we have full automation and we don't have to work. But I don't think that kind of future will take place. Even if the AI and the robots develops, we just still have to work, but also very boring work. And so it's even more dystopian. And in order to overcome this problem, I think it's important to recognize that scarcity is not a natural threshold. It's not a natural problem. It's rather created by social relationship. It's a scarcity that we today confront is often the social scarcity. It's not that our technology is too primitive, that we don't have enough food or we don't have enough water or electricity and so on. We do have enough.
Oh, okay, so he actually does
Such a
notice that.
capacity even to destroy this entire planet, going beyond planetary boundaries. The problem is, so not the natural side, but social side. And this is the system of monopoly, the system of just huge inequality and history. And that must change. And if we recognize this, and if we focus more on the public luxury, it becomes unnecessary to maximize technology. So that's why we don't need eco-modernist technologies anymore. It is totally possible to achieve, this is the only way to achieve post-scarcity economy based on public luxury and private sufficiency. Thank you so much.
Okay. Look at that, right on time. That worked out well. You'd think I planned it.
Yeah, you did.
Well, I tried anyway, yeah. I always try to make a plan. It's nice when it comes together. I have to try to judge. Well, we got to talk. How much time? Yeah, that worked out remarkable.
Well, I got a big kick out of the change in his hair over the years. He just let it grow.
It's getting more wild.
Is that when he was younger, though? What year was that?
Yeah, I think like the first video I showed you was probably an early one. And then this one is just from a few months ago.
Oh.
So yeah, you can see his hair changing as the years go by. Okay. All right. We're almost done. Any last questions or thoughts?
My last, I don't know why it comes up, but we don't mention beauty at all.
Mm,
The necessity for beauty and
mm.
where we find it.
That was a different class, right? Well, the class I taught on awe.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I forgot.
I talk about it, but he hasn't talked about it. Yeah.
No, no.
But
Right.
that would be one of the pursuits of people
Yeah,
when they
exactly.
had time. Their talents would be.
Yeah.
I read somewhere where in the Scandinavian countries, because the pay disparity isn't as great, people actually go into vocations that they love
Mm,
rather than vocations that pay the most money. So I thought that's another way that capitalism or money sort of corrupts us, right? Is we go into things just because of the money, and then we're not happy about it, and then we're not very good at it.
mm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, all the kids in college majoring in business. Like what are you doing? What is this? What kind of life are you expecting?
Right. Yeah,
Where,
that's
where,
true.
where's the meaning in that? Yeah.
But I do think that is changing. I think that people are looking more for becoming plumbers or carpenters. I think it's changing this attitude to having to go to college. There are more
Well, as long
students.
as they love plumbing is the point.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, there definitely is some of that. I mean, we have a little vacation place out in the South Sound, and on the way there, there's this little farm that turns out owned by a guy who used to live in West Seattle, and he decided he wanted to be a farmer, and he found this little plot of land, and he raises chickens and pigs and cows and a little bit of vegetables, and but that's where we get our eggs and chicken now is from Farmer Grant. And it was the lifestyle he wanted to choose, and so he chose it and is making it happen. Yeah, I mean there are people doing that kind of thing, definitely. I mean, there's always resistance going on. Is kind of a natural resistance to the system, is to say, okay, I'm going to just do something I want to do.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the point is to make that freely available for everyone to make that choice
Right.
that I want to do. Yeah.
Yeah, because that also takes money to do that.
Yeah, yeah, you had some resource. You had to buy the farm somehow.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, 1 o'clock hour.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was very
Thank you.
Well, thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you so
difficult,
much.
Enjoyed
difficult
teaching
but interesting.
Bye, Jane.
Bye.
I don't have an idea for a fall class yet.
Okay.
So, any ideas? Send them my way.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Once started with Joanna sending me a suggestion.
Okay.
So, and Helena, I did actually track down a copy of the book that you mentioned, the Courtier and the Prof. No, I'm forgetting the name. The one that was about Spinoza.
Yeah. Yeah.
I haven't and I've started reading it, but it's striking me as a little more esoteric than I know what to do with for this content.
Yeah, I understand.
But anyway, so
But it's
any ideas?
interesting.
All righty. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.